Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I hope this finds you well. So this week we are moving on to social stratification, and then next few weeks move into talking about gender stratification, race stratification. Today or this week we're examining, basically defining, providing some concepts around stratification. What is it? How do we think about it sociologically? And then shine a little bit of light on what's gone on in terms of patterns of stratification over a course of time. So kind of start off with just sort of maybe a visual here, thinking about this is what stratification kind of is. This is an image from the painted desert. Think about it geologically. We're looking at strata. We're looking at, basically layers, right? Stratification, layers. And the layers that we have, the number of layers, the separation between the top and the bottom, the separation between groups, all those things are not natural, inevitable. They're shaped by a lot of historical, cultural things that are going on, and they move across time. So it's important sort of to kind of keep that in mind as well. The other image I have sort of here in that PowerPoint slide is sort of thinking about more as sort of this worker rights, so this sort of development in we develop industrial capitalism. The place of the worker has a different place. And we are in a different economy today, or transition more away from that industrial economy to a post-industrial one, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Kind of introduce this sort of idea of the just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis is that we want to believe that the world is a just place. We are taught, significantly taught, that if you work hard, put your nose to the grindstone, and do the right things and do them well, and you are a good person, that you will be able to achieve a high degree of success. So we believe that the world's just, right? Those who are at the bottom are there, that there's a reason why that they're, those at the top, there's a reason why they're, that they deserve sort of their placement in society. So what we always have to wrestle with is that self-determination, the individual and context. So we're saying is that every individual is making decisions within a context. The distinction is that our contexts are different. So if you, based on your race, your class, your gender, your position in society, is shaping what kind of opportunities you have available to you, how you can navigate kind of opportunities, resources around you, and all these different kind of things. The just world hypothesis is this idea is that we believe the world is just and we want it to be, and we will hold on to that idea even when we have a lot of counter evidence to that. This is Jeff Bezos, his earnings from last year, or his overall sense of his overall portfolio, what he's worth is $110 billion. And then you sort of compare it to the workers who are working in the factory, the distribution centers for Amazon. And I mean, there's a lot of things you think about. Well, okay, how Jeff Bezos, 110 billion. I mean, definitely. I mean, hard work, creative, innovative, pushing boundaries in new ways. There's no doubt. We also got to sort of put things in a little bit of a larger context too, in terms of some of the technologies that are being used within Amazon came from both different public sectors, as well as so the government, as well as the private sector. Part of that, being able to achieve that kind of wealth through Amazon, is sometimes at the consequence of workers and worker rights and compensation for workers. Amazon is very anti-oppositional to unions because that would infringe upon, I think, they may claim it infringe upon their values and the ideas that they have in terms of running a company independent, more independent from a worker voice. But they're hard on unions. The impact of that is that facilitates greater distinction between the top and the bottom. But when we see, the big point here is when we see Bezos, we think, well, it's just, right? Because it's hard work and dedication. Does race play a factor? Does gender play a factor? What about kind of his background? What about his own family history? Where did he come from? These are the things it's not only hard work, it's the individual within a context. It's really important. As Americans, this is, I think, a really powerful chart. Percent who disagree disagree that success is determined by outside forces. So the percent of Americans who say, hey, it's not based on outside forces, it's internal. I mean, we are kind of an outlier. We are on the end of individualism. For people who say that it's very important to work hard to get ahead, we're on that end of it's hard work and dedication. So I think it's important to recognize is that our cultural values put us in that place about rugged individualism, hard work, dedication. The just world hypothesis is going to fit more for us. The reality is that over the last 20, 30 years, the gap between the top and the bottom has grown, and social mobility, the ability to move up, which has been a promise of sort of the American dream and the ideal of the American dream, is mobility. Mobility is probably the rates of mobility are probably highest in the 1940s, 1950s. Even for marginalized racial groups like African Americans, there was more mobility during that time period. We are shrinking mobility in terms of looking at our mobility in the United States. Okay, thinking about stratification, we got to recognize it's a trait of a structure and a system. It's not a trait of individuals. So we're looking at things at a system level analysis. Also recognizing that stratification is universal. It's universal across time and place, but it's also variable, right? So not all countries do stratification the same way. So we look at, of course, Nordic countries are oftentimes identified as being the most egalitarian of capitalist-based economies. So these are democratic socialist economies, mixed market economies. We like to think that we are a capitalist-driven economy. We are in part. We are probably one of the most fiercely opposed to government involvement in the private sector. We also do have a lot of government-based programs, right? So we are a mixed economy as well in terms of government and the public and the private sector. Medicare, for example, it's a government-based program. So there's no pure capitalist country. There's no pure socialist country. At least, we're looking at developed countries and developed economies. So it's variable. And the last is you have to have ideologies or beliefs to support it, right? So we have to have an ideology to support Bezos and the increased concentration of wealth. We have to have an ideology that allows us to accept that. Otherwise, we'd be crying foul and we'd be demanding some sort of sense of change. And that's an ideology, a belief that's accepted throughout culture, not just among the wealthy, but the middle class and the lower class as well. Okay, so a little bit of a distinction between like a caste system, which is a closed system. People oftentimes think of India as being a caste system, which it was, and it was supported by Hindu beliefs. So religion had a way of shaping those beliefs that reinforced that caste system. And it was agreed upon by most members of society. In the United States, we have, Jim Crow. Jim Crow starting after Reconstruction, after the end of the Civil War, or shortly after the end of the Civil War, all the way up until the 1950s with desegregation and movement towards desegregation. So by law, things were segregated. That's like a caste-like system. Apartheid in South Africa, apartheid is a segregation, legal segregation. So we had apartheid, South Africa apartheid. And now we talk about maybe that there's still a caste system. What Michelle Alexander argues is that the criminal justice system becomes the new caste kind of like system. Class is more open. Class systems are more open. The belief and the ideology that we have is no longer rooted in religion as it was with caste, but more this idea of merit. Those who work hard, those the most skilled, the most talented, are those who get the most rewards in this kind of in this world. That eliminates the reason. It's not to say that merit does not matter, but when we focus only on merit, that eliminates from discussion all those things about institutional advantage and institutional inequities, ranging from K through 12 education and exposure to education, opportunities in one's community, exposure, all that stuff. Meritocracy blinds us to all that. It forces us not to look at that. So I'm not going to show this video right now, but I encourage you to open up the PowerPoint, go here to redlining, and this particular video, I'll try to put it in Blackboard as well, but it's basically an example of something going on like a neo-apartheid. This is 1950s, but there's a rule put into place, a law put into place, and a practice put in place by banks that was supported by the law. And that's basically forced segregation, created environment of segregation. We can also think about, one of the things I think about stratification today as we're moving forward as well, is let's look at education, like the world that we live in today versus maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, and the kinds of jobs that were available. So here we have, I'm gonna go to share screen. I think I've moved out of that, sorry about that. Here's, if I missed that, here's the video, it's this slide, here's the link to it. If we look at, look at how we think about stratification over time in the United States. 1965, the silent generation, bachelor's degree, high school education. This is the gap between these groups. High school, 2-year college. Pretty close, right? But what we see really over a course of time, going to 1970s, 1980s, and then sort of flattening out. And then really the top 1%, as we could see, is really escalated. But education, the more education, the more an individual can participate in the economy in ways that are economically beneficial. And the gap is a significant one. Then we got to start thinking about things like, what about access to education, right? What about cost of education? If this is sort of the reality where the higher paying jobs are, then you need college education. Well, then is there a difference in terms of access to education based on your own background? So you can kind of see this shift in terms of 1940 to today, the number of people 25 and older who completed high school versus a bachelor's degree. I mean, just a significant increase, just trying to demonstrate or kind of illustrate, highlight that to participate in this economy requires more education, which is expensive. 1987, cost was about $40,000, now it's $103,000. So big cost difference in terms of education. That's adjusted for inflation. Here's Oregon State University, threefold increase adjusted for inflation. 1987, could graduate without debt. Fairly like to be able to do that. Today, individuals are in debt for at least a year to be able to make that happen. So it's a different economy, okay? It's kind of what I'm trying to highlight. So we talk about this as like this shift that happened in the late 1970s as structural social mobility, and I'll bring that concept or show that concept in a minute. Watch this video, it's really powerful. Again, I'll try to put it into the week folder, but it really kind of provides a great kind of visual of growth of inequality over the course of time. I wish they would remove the music. The music's like this, dun, 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 dun. It's like a little dramatic, which I think I'd like to not have that in there, just to provide the data versus trying to get theatrical with the data. That'd be my one critique, but the data is powerful. If you can see beyond that and just listen to, it's just really powerful. This I think is important too, okay? So average CEO versus the average worker. Look what's going on. Okay, all the way until like late 1980s, and then we saw this huge shift of the average worker and, I think we go back to this, to the average worker and the average CEO. So all the way to the late 1980s, then boom. At some point, early 2000s, 400 to 1, the average CEO versus the average worker. I mean, part of that story would be things like technology, technological advancements, bigger corporations, global corporations. So some of that's there, but we have to have an ideology that accepts that. I mean, not all countries that experience globalization, capitalist-based economies, allow for that to happen, right? So Germany, capitalism, capitalist-based economy, there's a different sense of rules going on within their economy that prevent that distinction or that gap between the average worker and the average CEO. Okay, so one thing I think about, just throw this out there too, is like, well, how do we provide, let's say, the resources and education and things like that, making sure that everyone has an opportunity to be able to participate effectively in this particular economy. And we look at sort of the tax rate overall as a percentage of gross domestic product, or of all goods and services provided in a country, that we pay relatively low. I mean, or a lot lower than other countries. So our tax rate, one way to, how do we just redistribute resources? Part of it would be through taxes. And I just find it interesting that sometimes there's this discussion about any increase in taxes. There's a lot of hostility towards that. Well, that's ideological. I mean, that resistance to that has to do with a lot of belief. It'd be one thing if it came from careful economic analysis, but there's political and economic and social motivations that are built into, not redistributing resources in ways that make them more equitable and more fair for participating in this economy. So we have intragenerational mobility, which is within a generation. Well, this is within a generation. It's like me, I used to work in a factory. I worked in a machine shop, and I just sort of moved just kind of doing things, right? That's within one generation, within my lived experience. That's intra. Inter, it's my dad, myself, my kids. That's all across generations. And then there's structure. A lot of what we're talking about here is structure, right? Like something happened with the economy that's much more macro level. And that thing that happened was a post-industrial economy, that we moved to a less manufacturing, more services. So think about the book that I want to write. I mean, I'll never write it. I got the title for it. Bend used to be, lumber town. So the topic of my book is from lumber to lingerie, the post-industrial experience as experienced in Central Oregon or something. So we go from lumber manufacturing to consumerism, lingerie, right? So the types of jobs that we have in this new economy are in service industry, are lower paying, and workers are not represented in terms of union. Unions represent employees. They bargain for, help employees bargain to achieve better working conditions, wages, and benefits. Currently in the United States, and I'll show this here right now, is we have about 13% of our employees belong to a union, and most of those are in the public sectors, like school teachers, law enforcement, firefighters, public sector. I mean, look at Sweden, 82% of workers are in a union. Workers have a voice. One of the challenges that we face is where workers can have a voice, we are very oppositional to, we as a country, as corporate America is very oppositional to workers having a voice. And I think that's by design. I mean, that serves interests, and there's a lot of ideology that's sort of built on that. Just sort of an example of what's the impact. In the United States, the federal government is not required to provide any sick leave, okay, or paid leave. Those aren't requirements. I mean, companies do that because it's a benefit that's offered, but it's not mandated. We're the only industrialized country that does not have paid family medical leave. We don't have maternity or paternity leave. So people's jobs are protected. So there's laws in terms of somebody, leaves the workforce for the delivery of a child and taking care of a young child. There's protections. People have to apply for short-term disability or to get financial benefit, but there's no government mandated program in the United States or law that's providing resources for young families in that way. So you got to explain that. Like, we're the only one. So how do you explain it? And it has to be ideologically driven. So one of the critiques, one of the theories talked about in the book is this culture of poverty. Oscar Lewis, anthropologist, studied immigrant families in city centers, and he had this idea of the culture of poverty, that people who are poor develop behaviors, attitudes, and values that they pass on to their kids that keep them in poverty. So for example, people who are poor tend to not save, they tend not to be invested in education and institutions around them. And the significant critique of Lewis's work starting in the 1980s was that, are the poor not saving because they don't have a value towards savings, or are they struggling for survival that they can't save? And what Lewis was interpreting, the sort of like which one's coming first, the cart or the horse, what's causing what, that kind of critique, they're kind of going on backwards. That what was driving poverty was not the values, but the poverty itself was shaping the choices and behaviors of individuals in poverty. Okay, so let's kind of talk about, with the remaining time here, talk about the different theories of stratification. I'll go through these pretty quick. You can read about these, and there's also videos about them. But basically, the idea of stratification from a functionalist perspective, it has to have a function, has to have a purpose. We have different rewards for different jobs based on the importance of the job, the requirements to get the job. So you have to have, the doctor needs to be paid, the surgeon needs to be paid more than the person drawing blood because of the specialty of that labor, the knowledge required, and the importance of that itself. But the limit, so logically that makes sense. The limitation of that model, it doesn't address how far, how much inequality or how much differential rewards do we need to have in order to make that happen. And also it doesn't account for how our institutions sometimes structured in a way that prevents people from moving in different directions, whether gender or race. And how sometimes even the work that goes on and the compensation for that work is somewhat gendered as well. So for example, in teaching or library, fields that are female dominated, when wages tend to be lower than in male dominated fields. There are some issues going on there that functionalism I don't think can address. This just becomes an example. Just try to pull up like, okay, here's different levels of workers within a healthcare setting, right? So functionalism would say you have to have a differential rewards based on the importance of the job, but it can't provide us a lot of insight into, yeah, but that much difference. Like that seems like a lot, at what point does it become too much and dysfunctional? Conflict theory focuses on economic relations between the bourgeoisie, the owners of production, so you think about it like the CEO, board of directors, or the proletariat, the workers. And what conflict theory recognizes, it's about economic relations, the haves, the have-nots, who's controlling the system, who's benefiting from the system. And capitalism increases inequality. This is Marx's model of capitalism that you had. You had the workers, you had the bourgeoisie, you had the military, you had the monarchy, you had religion, you had everything sort of propping up this sort of system in terms of capitalism. The dominant ideology in our system is meritocracy, right? You work hard to get ahead. And like I said before, it's an ideology. There's some truth to that, but it's not the whole story, right? Would Jeff Bezos started Amazon if he grew up in the South in an impoverished environment and didn't have access to good schools or around individuals that were exposed to business and industry and innovation? I mean, I think it'd be very hard to accept that his early life experience and opportunities that he had did not play a factor in terms of where he ended up. Tokenism is the idea that there's a token. Somebody does come from the bottom, and they do make it to the top, they become a token. And we look at them and go, well, they made it, therefore everybody else can make it. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, right? They become a token. The idea that Marx offers is that we need to move from we accept as a culture, we accept the ideology, and we develop false consciousness. And we align our interest with the interest of the ruling class. We, meaning everyone else. So we vote against the estate tax. We vote against increasing taxes on the wealthy. We, meaning more the collective population. And what Marx says, the workers have to start to realize, people have to start to realize how the system is set up to benefit those who are the haves, and they need to develop consciousness and start to advocate for change. A little bit of that's going on now, right? There's racial consciousness, gender consciousness, and maybe a little bit of class consciousness as well. Bourdieu and Weber provide a little bit different perspective. So Weber focuses on wealth, power, and status. It's not just about the economic relations that Marx is stating, the owner versus the worker. Marx, let's say, well, it's part wealth, part power, part status. So for example, a plumber, right? A plumber, their class or wealth, the amount of money, let's say, higher than the elementary school teacher. But yet status-wise, school teacher may be a higher level status. The power, meaning social political power, may be different. Celebrity may have a lot of wealth, a lot of status in the general community, but maybe not a lot of political power. But we've increasingly given them political power. I mean, that's kind of, one thing to consider. But Weber kind of gets into this, like this culture dimension starts to enter into it. Bourdieu focuses on the reproduction of our class position. So these are these terms. So for example, The Unequal Childhood is a fabulous work by Annette LaRue, who interviewed 88 different families, spent time with them, with ethnographic work, chatted with them, watched them, observed them, just sort of like, what's the logic of parenting in these different families? And her analysis was that if you grew up the middle class, professional middle class families, kids learn the language of middle class. They learn the habits of middle class that give them institutional advantage when they're moving through education, the workforce. It becomes part of their habitus, the way of thinking, knowing, doing. And it becomes natural to them. Her argument is that in the working class, perfectly, neither the working class nor the middle class are better parents. But both of them are parenting in ways that make sense given their class position. And the kids in the middle class develop habitus that provides advantage. Kids from a working class haven't developed the habitus, the cultural language, the skills and ability, the sense of empowerment of advocating for themselves as they move through institutions. I mean, all this stuff that's going on. So Bourdieu focuses on this kind of cultural reproduction component. Cultural capital, the things that you know, social capital, the people that you know. It makes sense, right? I mean, I think Central Oregon is a lot of social capital community. Getting certain jobs is about who you know, not about your credentials, so to speak. So, the more you're in a position of, in the hierarchy, higher up, the more you can exchange those social capital, those connections for higher paying jobs, more access to more institutions. So cultural reproduction. And kind of end with, I'll go through this really fast, but that just to kind of indicate that we can do something, right? That things can change. And here's some ideas of change. One of them is, which, we've done recently, right, is moving towards higher minimum wage. Central Oregon in general tends to be on the higher end in terms of minimum wage. It's one way that we can reduce economic inequality. You go over to Utah, minimum wage is a federal minimum wage, 7 and change for an hour. I mean, cost of living is a little bit different, no doubt about that. But we can do something about economic inequality by wages, setting the minimum wage. Also things like tax credits, like trying to figure out a way to use the tax system in a way to take some pressure off those that are near the bottom, down the bottom part of our kind of strata. Tax reform measures, capital gains, increase capital gains taxes, payroll taxes, income taxes, examine that. I mean, talk about political hot buttons, right? Talk about things that are really challenging to address. But I mean, these are models forward, right? To say that we can't change things, there become breaking points. It becomes really dysfunctional, if you get to a certain degree of inequality. So these are just models. Invest in early childhood education. A great equalizer is access to resources at a young age. So to invest in early childhood education, K through 12. So going to Head Start program in the 1960s, the President Johnson administration, the declaration of war on poverty. I mean, Head Start program was to give individuals that were in impoverished environments access to early childhood ed, so they wouldn't be behind when they started school. So invest in early childhood education. And then finally, the last one would be to help individuals in the lower middle income families build wealth. Tax policies that favor individuals the ability to buy a home, they can get the privilege of that investment, and sort of be able to figure out ways to generate a system that gives individuals an opportunity to gather wealth. Because wealth is something that we can exchange and we pass on to our family, and it has intergenerational impact. All right, thanks. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope that was good food for thought. No question for this week. I'll probably stop doing the question thing. I think it's just enough to cover content in the video itself. So have yourself a great week and catch you next week. Take care.